It could be argued that industrialization was merely the natural consequence of the scientific revolution, as the movements which responded to it grew out of the Enlightenment. Now, throughout the 19th century, science was changing, not merely how people lived, but how they thought about their world. In his System of Positive Politics, or Treatise on Sociology of 1851, Auguste Comte argued for positivism, the belief that a scientific approach to all human problems, the accumulation of hard facts and their quantification, would produce sound, positive laws for society and concrete results. The search for such facts was undertaken by the social sciences, especially sociology, a term first coined by Comte in 1838. But science also had a disturbing tendency to upset old orthodoxies. Marx and Engels billed themselves as scientists. Progress meant change, and more scientific inquiry yielded more questions. Take the most basic facts about the natural world. How old is the Earth? And how did humans first appear on it? At the end of the 18th century, new geologic findings and the discovery of strange fossils bearing no apparent relation to current animals and plants raised questions about the age of the Earth and how the present species came to be. A generation or so later, Charles Lyell established the modern science of geology, publishing the Principles of Geology in 11 revised editions between 1830 and 1870, so this became a standard work. James Hutton argued that contrary to the 6,000-year time frame established by Bishop Ussher, the Earth was immeasurably old. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck developed an early theory of evolution in his Zoological Philosophy of 1809 and The Natural History of Animals Without Backbones in 1815 and 1822. He argued that life began with simple organisms, which evolved over eons of time as a result of interaction with the environment. But he was not clear on exactly how that happened. It was Charles Darwin who put it all together. Now, Darwin was a typical middle-class Victorian Englishman. His father was a doctor, his mother was a Wedgwood heiress, and perhaps more importantly, his grandfather was Erasmus Darwin, a natural philosopher, a physician, and the author of Zoonomia, which had argued that life in nature was a struggle for existence among animals. Darwin was educated at Cambridge, famous for the sciences, remember that Newton was a Cambridge man, and at Edinburgh, famed for its medical school. So he was educated as an MD, but also as a clergyman. In 1831 to 36, he signed on as the ship's botanist on the scientific expedition of HMS Beagle to the South American coast, specifically the Galapagos Islands. He collected animals and fossils. He noted slight differences in the living specimens, both from the fossils and between habitats. Evolution, Darwin thought, explains the variations that he noted. Now, in a sense, there was nothing new here. Scientists had largely accepted evolution for half a century. What was new was that Darwin suggested a mechanism by which evolution might take place: natural selection. The key for Darwin was reading Malthus's essay on population. Darwin realized that nature was a great competition for food. Who would win that competition? The species or representatives of that species that were best fitted to win it. Think of the giraffe. Which giraffe gets the most leaves? The tallest. Because the tallest giraffe gets the most leaves, the tallest will be the healthiest giraffe and the best fitted to survive drought or natural disasters. This giraffe then becomes the most likely to be selected by a potential mate and the most likely to reproduce. Darwin called his idea natural selection and explained it in The Origin of Species, which was published in 1859. The book was rapidly accepted in the scientific world, for it explained so much, but was a shock everywhere else. Darwin himself said that when he first hit upon the idea of natural selection, he felt as if he were committing murder. Why? Why should Darwin's ideas have been so controversial? Why do they remain so today? On a basic level, Darwin denied the biblical account of creation. Obviously, the evolution of modern species had to take place over eons of time, not 6 days. In Darwin's words, the Bible presented, quote, a manifestly false history of the world. But in fact, this is a bit of a red herring. Science had been advocating evolution and denying the 6-day creation for a century. Moreover, 19th century biblical scholars like David Friedrich Strauss, using modern techniques of textual criticism and history and archaeology, had been moving away from a literalist interpretation of the Bible anyway. What really bothered theologians about Darwin was that he seemed to have removed God from the equation entirely. Remember Newton, the deists, and their watchmaker God? Darwin took this all one step further. The survival or extinction of species, the survival or extinction of individual beings, was apparently automatic and unfair. It was based on brute force. In Darwin's universe, God was certainly not concerned at the fall of every sparrow. Rather, nature's law, or God's, if he was concerned in it at all, was unfeeling and cruel. Thus, Alfred Lord Tennyson famously referred to nature red in tooth and claw. Nature seemed to work not unlike modern industrial capitalism. Only the fittest survive. Which raises the question, what if you applied these ideas to the world of men and women? You'll remember the Enlightenment tradition that natural law worked for man's benefit, and that man was a supremely rational creature. Darwin argued that man was just an animal in competition with other animals. A set of writers, known as the social Darwinists, followed the implications of these ideas without Darwin's permission. Herbert Spencer, in his Social Statistics, which began publishing as early as 1851, and Synthetic Philosophy in 10 volumes, 1860 to 90, and Walter Bagehot, in Physics and Politics of 1872, argued that history was the struggle of the strong against the weak. Clearly, the civilized, the powerful, the wealthy are so because they are best fitted, are nature's and society's best. Clearly, the uncivilized, the powerless, and the poor are so because they're unfit, nature's losers, destined to be ground into the dust. To preserve them via charity, social welfare programs, was simply to prolong their agony, like preserving a genetically imperfect animal and encouraging both to breed. Laissez-faire economic policies, in contrast, would allow the cream to rise to the top. So this is a little different from Adam Smith, who says that all benefit from laissez-faire economies. This philosophy simply embraces the winners. Thus, just as Europeans were about to contemplate and struggle over conquering and expanding empires, the rights of workers and the poor, and the rights of women, Darwin and the theory of natural selection were used to justify racism, imperialism, classism, and sexism. Most controversial of all was the implication left unstated in The Origin of Species, that if all nature evolved from a primitive state, surely so did man. But from what? Darwin, aware of the potential uproar, refused to say until 1879, when he published The Descent of Man. But the writing was already on the wall. We descended from primates, apes. Now, to many Victorians, this served to humiliate man, or at least render him no better than any other animal. These two worldviews, one rational and scientific, the other faithful and romantic, have been clashing ever since. They first met in public debate at Oxford in 1860 at the annual meeting of the British Association. Now, the traditionalist position was represented by Bishop Samuel Wilberforce, a famous and powerful orator of the day, popularly known as Soapy Sam. The Darwinians were represented by Thomas Henry Huxley, a scientific writer and popularizer. This is sort of Jerry Falwell versus Carl Sagan in the Victorian period. At the climax of the debate, Wilberforce, smiling, turned to Huxley and begged to know, was it through his grandfather or grandmother that he claimed descent from a monkey? Huxley replied, he was not ashamed to have a monkey for an ancestor, but he would be ashamed to be connected with a man who used great gifts to obscure the truth. And that was that. The 19th century equivalent of, Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy. Darwinian evolution came to be accepted scientific orthodoxy at the end of the 19th century. It explained or fit too much to be dismissed the growing fossil record and the genetic experiments of Gregor Mendel. Mendel explained how Darwin's useful traits were passed on to the next generation. Mendel was an Augustinian monk at a monastery in Brno, Czechoslovakia, which was known for scientific inquiry. He built on the work of 18th century taxonomists who grouped and ranked living species. He studied 28,000 pea plants for heredity and evolution in a series of what I think we can all agree are tedious experiments. He developed if you study 28,000 of anything, believe me, it's a tedious experiment. He developed the idea of inheritance by means of genes. He identified the notions of dominance and recessiveness, and he published his work in 1866. Now that work is heavily quantitative, and that may explain the fact that it didn't really make much of an impact before 1900. Far more immediately important to physical medicine were the discoveries of Pasteur and Koch. Louis Pasteur was a professor of chemistry at the University of Lille, but it may be important to understand Pasteur to know that he had lost 3 daughters to typhus. To assist the French wine industry, he studied the process of fermentation and identified microorganisms, bacteria, which sour wine. He saved the French silk industry by teaching them how to identify and cull bacterially infected eggs. He also came to understand how milk sours. He developed the idea of pasteurization, heating milk to kill that bacteria. From all this work, Pasteur constructed the germ theory of disease, which was immediately controversial. The idea that microscopic organisms could kill large ones seemed laughable to some people. But it was gradually proved by Pasteur's courageous experiments on anthrax vaccination, rabies vaccination. This involved a famous 1885 inoculation of a small boy. Septicemia, cholera, diphtheria, tuberculosis, and smallpox. In 1888, the Institut Pasteur was founded, one of the world's great research centers into communicable disease, most famously identified with identifying the HIV virus causing AIDS. Robert Koch developed these ideas in Germany. In the 1870s, he isolated the disease-causing agent in anthrax, thus demonstrating that Pasteur was right. He developed techniques for working with infectious agents. In the 1880s, he worked on infectious wounds, explaining how tetanus worked. In 1882, he announced the isolation of the bacteria causing tuberculosis. In the next year, he went to India to study and isolate bacteria causing cholera. And in 1891, he became the director of Berlin's Institute for Infectious Disorders, now the Koch Institute. New technology in the 19th century also had an impact on medicine. In surgery, from the 1840s, anesthesia became available. Nitrous oxide, ether, or chloroform. Queen Victoria famously allowed herself to be chloroformed during one of her pregnancies in 1852. She reported the effect to be, quote, soothing, quieting, and delightful beyond measure. I guess it doesn't take much to delight Queen Victoria. Joseph Lister, who studied with Pasteur, developed antiseptics in 1865. As surgeon to the Glasgow Royal Infirmary, he tackled the 50% mortality rate in its surgery. Embracing Pasteur's germ theory, he applied carbolic acid to surgical instruments and cut surgical mortality to 12%. By the 1880s, these practices had become widely accepted in Britain and were gaining on the continent. In 1895, Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen discovered X-rays. Now, if science was raising uncomfortable questions about man's place in the universe, the Enlightenment and its calls for the rights of man had raised similarly uncomfortable questions about the rights of women. Feminism was a new word, but not really a new idea in the 19th century. European history is full of writers who questioned the subordinate place of women. In the Middle Ages, the Abbess Heloise and Hildegard of Bingen, Eleanor of Aquitaine and Christine de Pizan. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Margaret Countess of Newcastle, Aphra Behn, and Mary Axtell. All were writers. All had a small, but admittedly mostly male, audience. A number of major European countries had, as we have seen, been ruled quite successfully by women. In the case of England, there was Elizabeth I and Anne and Victoria. Austria had been ruled effectively by Maria Theresa, and Russia by the Empress Elizabeth and then Catherine the Great. Now, it's ironic, none of these rulers were feminists themselves. They fought to be treated seriously among, and to a great extent as, men. They weren't interested in promoting freedom or opportunity for their fellow women. The key figure in changing that was Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary Wollstonecraft asked, at the height of the French Revolution, in A Vindication of the Rights of Women, why the benefits of the Enlightenment were restricted to men. She condemns the state of servile ignorance to which women were consigned and she asks in Enlightenment fashion why women should not be free to exercise their non-biological talents as men did. Ironically, she died in childbirth, having her daughter Mary, the future author of Frankenstein. John Stuart Mill, realizing that his own wife, Harriet Taylor, was smarter than he was, yet barred from public life by Victorian assumptions about gender roles, extends these ideas in On the Subjugation of Women, which became highly influential and translated into many languages in the 19th century. Mill accuses men of oppressing women, of squelching their freedom of initiative from the earliest times, but he also accuses women of buying into the prevalent system willingly, of concentrating on the cultivation of beauty rather than mental attainments, and of being trained from birth to serve and acquiesce in their own subordination, usually trained by other women. A good example that would have been obvious to everyone might be Victorian fashion, which loaded women with cumbersome dresses and tight lacing and bustles, which limited movement and even breathing, just as men were beginning to dress practically. They had exchanged knee breeches for trousers. The French author Amandine Dudevant reacted to this by violating every gender convention. She too wanted to dress practically. She took the pseudonym George Sand. She dressed in men's clothes, including trousers. She also engaged in a series of affairs with prominent intellectuals, including the composer Frédéric Chopin. She wrote novels and letters and memoirs, all celebrating her unconventional lifestyle. Early socialists like Saint-Simon and Frederick Engels also embraced the notion of female equality. And 19th century European feminists made progress on specific issues. For example, higher education. During the 19th century in both France and England, public education was gradually extended, then made mandatory for women. The first women's colleges of higher education were Girton College and Newnham College in Cambridge, founded in 1869 and 1871, respectively. In Russia and France, the government sponsored secondary and university courses after 1856. Individual women were able to graduate with professional degrees in law, in medicine, women's medical schools opened in Zurich and Paris, and with PhDs. Perhaps most famously, Marie Curie, born in Poland but working in France, investigated the properties of radium with her husband Pierre. They won a joint Nobel Prize in 1903, and when he died 3 years later, she assumed his position at the Sorbonne of the University of Paris, its first female faculty member. But for most women, professional opportunities were few and far between. Women were becoming a more common sight in certain areas of the workplace, factory work, and some fields were increasingly associated with women. Teaching and secretarial work became female occupations only in the 19th century. Now, reformers weren't sure about this. They actually passed laws limiting the work women could do. Women were barred from night work and barred from some industrial processes. The idea was to protect women, but also the idea was to protect men from the jobs being taken away by women. And there were worries over women's childbearing capacity. So this idea of liberal reformers to protect women from certain professions was actually very controversial with feminists. So were contemporary attitudes towards sex, marriage, and divorce. In most European countries, women were viewed practically as property and could not own their own property if married. There were no rights of divorce, no right of refusal of marital rights, and indeed no recognition of the possibility of marital rape. Birth control was largely outlawed in Europe. Indeed, the 19th century, responding to the challenge of feminism, emphasized female domesticity. In the words of Alfred Lord Tennyson, man for the field and women for the hearth. But some women fought back on specific fronts. In England, Caroline Norton, the abused wife of a drunken lout, campaigned for the right of women to initiate divorce proceedings, which she won in 1857. Also in England, Josephine Butler fought laws that went after prostitutes, not their clients. Regarding birth control, in England, Amy Besant campaigned for the right to distribute information on birth control. In the Netherlands, Alita Jacobs established the first birth control clinic in the 1880s. But this too was controversial with feminists. Some thought that removing the risk of pregnancy would actually lead to more sexual exploitations. This is a difficult issue. Beginning in 1870 in England, married women were allowed to own their own property in their own right. But the ultimate goal, a voice in politics, remained elusive. During the 19th century, female suffrage was really only an issue for the West, especially England and the United States. During the first half of the 19th, and that's of course because no male in the East has a vote. During the first half of the 19th century, many women took the lead in other ways. They took the lead in charitable organizations. They joined liberal and reform clubs. Women were very active in British Chartism, for example. They helped establish temperance and anti-slavery societies. In the 1850s and 1860s in England, John Stuart Mill helped found the first Women's Suffrage Association in 1865 and introduced the first women's suffrage bill in Parliament, which of course got nowhere. In England, two approaches emerged by the end of the 19th century. The National Society for Women's Suffrage urged persuasion, peaceful protest, and incremental change. But the Women's Social and Political Union, founded in 1903 and led by Emmeline Pankhurst, urged violence if necessary. Men got the vote because they were and would be violent. The women did not get it because they were constitutional and law-abiding. Elsewhere, she wrote, "The argument of the broken pane of glass is the most valuable argument in modern politics." Radical feminism was born. Stay tuned. Now, positivism and feminism were only two currents in a rushing torrent of ideas that threatened to overwhelm the last remaining links of the great chain of being. In the arts, Romanticism continued, but with more of an edge to it. A good example would be the novelist Victor Hugo, who was both a romantic and a reformer. In Claude Gueux, he attacked the French penal system in 1834. In Les Miserables, he took on the whole French social system. His vivid depictions of urban poor laid the groundwork for realism. In painting, book illustrators like Gustave Doré were romantic, but they were also very realistic in their depiction of industrial life. In music, Johannes Brahms's melodies may seem romantic, but the Fourth Symphony and many of his chamber works end tragically, angrily, or ambiguously. The hero is defeated. Increasingly, realism and naturalism reacted against the idea of the romantic hero. Faced with the squalor of agricultural and working-class industrial life, artists tried to depict life as it really was. This was part of the same reformist impulse as the Sadler Commissions. In this work, humans tend to be crushed by their environment, and indeed by their animal nature. There's Darwin again. For example, in literature in France, Honoré de Balzac portrays Parisian society in all of its messiness in a series of novels entitled The Human Comedy. Flaubert's Madame Bovary depicts a woman who tries to cure her middle-class ennui by engaging in a series of sexual affairs, ending in her suicide. Émile Zola depicts working-class life with scientific precision. In Nana of 1880, he writes about a prostitute. In Women's Paradise of 1883, he depicts middle-class women as frenzied shoppers, seduced by the new department stores. And in Germinal of 1885, he writes about the lives of exploited coal miners in heart-rending detail. In Britain, Charles Dickens' nearly 24 novels, Oliver Twist, Hard Times, there are too many to name, famously indict the greed of industrial society. George Eliot is not so much a social reformer as an explorer of adult situations with all their moral ambiguity, perhaps at her height in Middlemarch of 1872. Thomas Hardy took on the institutions of marriage, class, and gender prejudice in Tess of the D'Urbervilles in 1891 and Jude the Obscure in 1895. In Russia, Dostoevsky, who writes Crime and Punishment and The Brothers Karamazov and many other great novels, Tolstoy's War and Peace and Anna Karenina are all realistic novels, but they're also shot through with moral philosophy. Finally, the Norwegian Henrik Ibsen's A Doll's House of 1879 depicts approvingly a woman leaving a loveless marriage. Again, all real life. In painting, we see a similar rejection of Romanticism after 1850. Courbet's paintings depict the hard work of agricultural workers. Jean-François Millet's Man with a Hoe of 1862 portrays an ordinary nameless man bent over in labor. But above all, photography, invented by L.J.M. Daguerre in the 1830s, can obviously claim to be realistic, the thing itself, not subject to the interpretation of the artist. Now, of course, we now know how much interpretation is involved in the setting up and the point of view and special effects and lighting and exposure, But at the time, it seemed that you were indeed getting the thing itself. Cheaper than painting, photographs bring reproduction into the price range of the middle, even occasionally the working class. It revolutionizes news reporting and war reporting and reporting about social problems. Now you can take photographs of the slums. In music, we see realism, I think, in the operas of Verdi. La Traviata depicts the fast life and tubercular death of a courtesan, a high-class prostitute. Rigoletto is about a sexual predator, the Duke, and the doomed attempt of the title character to save his daughter from him. Otello is about raw jealousy and marital violence. At the end of the century, Verismo opera, Leoncavallo's Pagliacci and Puccini's La Bohème, depicts poor people in squalid conditions with all of their passions. But music was also a vehicle for nationalism. In music, composers had always used folk melodies and popular songs. Haydn's symphonies are full of Hungarian melodies. In the 19th century, Brahms's Hungarian dances were fabulously popular, and Chopin's mazurkas and polonaises used Polish and Slavic dance forms. But increasingly in the 19th century, during the second half, we hear a self-conscious trumpeting of national myths. For example, Wagner's operas celebrate German mythology, Tristan und Isolde, Die Meistersinger, the massive four-opera cycle Dauerung des Nibelungen, music which would be used later by the Nazis for propaganda purposes. In the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Czech composers celebrated their Slavic heritage. Antonin Dvorak composed the Slavonic dances. His symphonies are full of folk melodies and dance forms, polkas and furiants. Bedřich Smetana composed a great six-movement cycle depicting episodes from Czech history and mythology called Má vlast, My Country, or My Fatherland. Now this art is political. It wasn't lost on anybody that Smetana didn't have a country yet. In Russia, Tchaikovsky incorporated folk dances and folk songs into his ballets, The Nutcracker, Swan Lake, and Sleeping Beauty, and into his symphonies. Number 2 is called The Little Russian. Number 3 is called The Polish. Remember that Russia ruled Poland at the time, and ends with a grand polonaise. And number 6, the Pathétique, quotes from the Russian Orthodox funeral liturgy. Now, after 1875, there's a kind of countervailing influence, I think, in French painting, where we see a movement away from the realism of photography towards Impressionism. Seurat, Degas, Manet, Monet, Renoir, and Van Gogh all move away from the realistic portrayal of the thing towards an impression of it, and in the case of the last artist, Van Gogh, a state of mind. They also, in history, we also see a moving away from romantic stories about great heroes and towards scientific precision and greater realism. What the great German historian Leopold von Ranke called wie es eigentlich gewesen ist, as it really happened. Now, associated with all of these movements and beliefs was a growing secularization. The state of religion varied across Europe. In England, the Church of England remained established, but there was a growing culture of doubt, which I think we've seen in the case of Darwin. In France, the Church had never really recovered the position lost at the French Revolution. And in Germany, the Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, and I realize that we haven't united Germany yet, but we will, he would launch a full-scale Kulturkampf, culture war, against the Roman Catholic Church, especially expelling Jesuits, making civil unions mandatory. Overall, in Europe, church attendance declined for workers and peasants. As men grew less interested in religion, however, women took up the slack. We also see a secularization among many urban Jews who begin to assimilate into a broader European culture. Now, as we saw in the case of evolution, conservatives bewailed all of these developments. The Roman Catholic Church in particular mounted an active resistance to modern trends and especially secularization. In 1854, the Pope proclaimed the Immaculate Conception of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and that led to an explosion of faith and devotion, especially among women all across Europe. So there's a sense of revitalization. In 1858, the visions of Bernadette of Lourdes became very well publicized. And remarkably, as demonstrated by my Loyola colleague, Suzanne Kaufman, the Church actually used modern technology and modern marketing to bring this story to the faithful and to foster faith. For example, they used modern advertising to attract pilgrims to Lourdes and to spread the word. Pilgrims were brought by train, and doctors had to certify the cures, which of course would then be related in the advertising. But if the church embraced the tools of modernity, it rejected the attitudes. In 1864, Pope Pius IX issued the Syllabus of Errors, condemning virtually the whole of modern civilization, including liberalism, socialism, and communism. In 1870, the First Vatican Council approved the doctrine of papal infallibility. But in 1878, a new pope, Leo XIII, began the process whereby the Church has come to terms with modernity. He accepted some elements of democracy, and he raised the standards of scholarship in Catholic universities and schools. Now, maybe the Pope's previous hostility to modernity is understandable, for he was one of many European rulers who lost power as a result of one of its hallmarks: nationalism.